We so happy we alive, we together can survive.
Good evening and welcome to Louisville Late Night. I'm Patrick Moore, and this evening we have the privilege of having with us Dr. Ralph Faris. And you see here Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison, and this is from Amazon, and this is Dr. Faris's book, Living in the Dead Zone, Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison. Dr. Gerald Faris, clinical psychologist, lecturer, and former assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the Yale University School of Medicine, and Dr. Ralph Faris, professor of sociology and director of the honors program at the College of Philadelphia, explain their findings about the lives of two icons of 1960s music and how each suffered from a little-known, complicated condition now clinically defined as borderline personality disorder. Living in the Dead Zone, Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison. Understanding Borderline Personality Disorder describes the torment of these two personalities. Joplin, the top female blues artist, and Morrison, the influential rocker and lead singer of The Doors. And here we have the book, Living in the Dead Zone, by Gerald and Ralph Faris. And so now we have the privilege of talking with Dr. Faris and finding out more about Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison, Living in the Dead Zone. Good evening, and welcome again to Louisville Late Night. This evening we're delighted to have with us Dr. Ralph Faris from the Community College of Philadelphia. And Dr. Faris is an author, and among his publications is a classic on the rock icons Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison of The Doors. Dr. Faris wrote the book Living in the Dead Zone. Is that correct? Along with his brother, Dr. Faris, who's Gerald, who's a psychology professor at the Yale University School of Medicine, as I just mentioned. So let me turn it over to Dr. Faris here, Dr. Ralph, and ask him how he got into this Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin. I guess you'd call it it's almost like a religion. How did you get into this? You were in Vietnam, right, Dr. Faris?
Yes, I was in the military for 3 years, and I served a tour of duty over in Vietnam. And I had a platoon of men that ran around the jungles there trying to win the war. Yeah, you know, you asked me how my brother and I thought about writing about Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison. Well, I have been, and still am, a big fan of Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison's. I like their music. Anything that they sang or developed or wrote, I was a Janis Joplin concert, and thought it was like the single best thing that I'd ever experienced in my life. You know, 17 or 18 anyway. Anyway, my brother and I were talking one day. He's a psychologist. He has a practice up in Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm a sociologist by trade. And, we happened to be listening to Me and Bobby McGee, which is one of Janis Joplin's most, I think it's probably one of her best known songs. I thought it's a terrific song. I can sing on every opportunity. We're listening to it on the radio, and I looked at Gerald and said, man, there was nothing quite like Janis Joplin. My brother said, nodded, and he's not as big a fan as I am of that particular music, but he had said, you know, Ralph, she was a borderline. And at the time, you know, borderline, it's a technical term inside the field of psychiatry, but now it is anyway. And when he said that to me, I thought he meant something hostile to her, or, you know, because after all, I really liked Janis Joplin. And I looked at him and I said, what are you talking about, borderline? She was terrific. And he said, well, I wasn't being critical of her. I was just diagnosing her, he said. I said, well, go diagnose somebody else. She's she's about as good as you're going to get out of anybody that knows how to sing. And he said, well, I wasn't being critical of it. You appreciate that all of the literature that I've read and the stuff that I've seen suggests strongly to me that she was a borderline person. She suffered from borderline personality disorder. So we had an argument for at least a couple of hours in which we went back and forth about how could possibly, after all, they're both dead, and he identified Jim Morrison in with the same category, slightly different, but anyway, we decided that we would explore this further in a book, and that's when we began watching all of the biographies, reading all the books. Janis Joplin's sister wrote a book. Several of the band members of the Doors have written books. You probably know them. And there have been multiple movies, including The Rose, which was a shadow life of Janis Joplin. It was a film presentation of her life. And as we began, my brother was fairly convinced before he even started, because he's got all of that background in psychology. But I was just now investigating their lives, the details of their lives, as if I were doing research on them. And not being happy, because I was finding the more I read, the more it was confirming my brother's diagnosis, or at least insofar as we understood what that diagnosis was. So even while we were writing the book, we were yelling and screaming at one another, and I was demanding more proof from him. So we read about just anything that's ever been written, columns, television interviews. For example, there was one with Dick Cavett used to have a talk show a long time ago. Your listeners may not have ever heard of Dick Cavett, but he was a fairly clever and very good at repartee, but he interviewed Janis Joplin on that show, and I'm telling you that Janis Joplin pretty much made mincemeat out of him in terms of her ability to shadow box with him on a television talk show. And so we watched that and listened to the way she responded and her affect and so forth, trying to get as much information as we could. But that's how we started. It started with an argument that he was maligning one of my boyhood heroes, somebody who sang a song, or songs that I thought were the best. They were called, in their day, they were called the king and queen of rock and roll, if you know anything about that music. And I thought, who could possibly have the temerity to attack the king and the queen?
And so when you did this research into their lives, what are some of the things that came to mind? I mean, when I think of Jim Morrison, for example, one of the stories that's out there is that Jim was doing the Doors were doing a concert in Miami, and Jim got up on stage with see-through pelvic area on his pants.
Got arrested.
Where his genitals were exposed. Is that an urban myth, or did?
Oh no, if you go on the basis of any of the members of his band who have written books and talked about him, what several of them have come to agree was that they were frightened every time they went on stage with him. They didn't know what he was going to do. Lizard King was his nickname, so yeah, he came on in various poses, of course, many of which got him in trouble, and one of them got him sent into a psychiatrist's office. He was assigned to. They thought he was out of order. But the one that I'm blocking the guy's name who wrote the book, one of the books on Morrison, one of his band members, who said he went on stage one night. They didn't know what he was going to do, and he went out on the stage. The band's all ready to play, and he stared at the audience for 27 minutes, not saying a word. And all of the time, or during that time, after about 10 minutes, the audience started to get restless and started yelling at him and screaming at him to get with it, and he just stood there and did nothing. And so the view there was, this guy was frightening, that because he's got a stage personality. And, you want to say, okay, there's a certain amount of creativity involved in that. But then there's also going over the edge, over the line, which he frequently crossed. And some of it is self-promotion, the kind of stuff you would do if you're an entertainer.
Right.
But some of it, and that's why you have to have, you need a model of a certain sort of paradigm to sort of disentangle that stuff, that perfectly appropriate, typical stuff of entertainers trying to get out there, from stuff that really was off the edge and revealing something more about him than perhaps he wanted, and probably more than his fans wanted. And the same with Janis. Janis was, there's several times I've seen her in concert, I thought she was going to hurt herself. I mean, just the way in which she she was very aggressive, very ambitious on a stage. The voice was terrific, and she would sing herself almost into being hoarse or something like that. So anyway, we after we finished reading through all of that literature, it became apparent to me, and of course my brother had already confirmed it in his own research, that they were indeed fit very closely the emerging borderline personality disorder. They were afflicted with it. And that got us into all kinds of... After the book came out, we had lots of different book signings in which there were two kinds of people who showed up. The people who were true blue dyed-in-the-wool fans, and from whom they did not want to hear anything, that was hostile to their heroes. And people who were desperate, absolutely and utterly desperate to get help for themselves because they had members of their family or their larger family who were, in their judgment, borderline, and they wanted help to figure out how can we control it. And so I usually I tell a story about the gal in the audience who she was of the first variety. And when my brother and I finished discussing very briefly what the disorder was, she raised her hand and said, "I have a question." She said, I just want to say, you know how people say they just want to say something? And really what they want to say is up yours, I don't want to hear this bullshit. I don't know if I can say this here, but I just want to say that I like Janis Joplin just the way she was. And on other book signings I've had the Morrison fans say, I like Jim Morrison just the way he was. And the only difficulty with that question, my brother's much smoother at this than I am. I was a little hostile back. My brother's being the psychologist, as a way of sort of cooling out people. But I was a little offended by it because, not because I felt myself personally attacked. You know, the hell, you can have your own view if you want. But because I thought it was a casual treating of somebody's death at the age of 28, who, if they had been properly diagnosed, might have lived into their 60s or 70s. The median age now is up around 80. So when you hear people say that, it's a little selfish. It's a little self-absorbed that they would say, I like their music and I like them just fine. Stop saying those terrible things about my hero. But you say, well, wake up. It's about time you heard the truth, and the truth is that their disorder was not in any way connected to their creativity. All of the studies about creativity and disorder do not show that. The people who are the most creative are also the most crazy. They don't show that at all. You can find a lot of crazy people who are creative, but it isn't a sine qua non. It isn't it might be a necessary but not a sufficient condition. And so that usually, my response to a question like that usually evokes more hostility. But in this particular episode, I said, look, let me be real straight with you about this. I love Janis Joplin. I would like to have seen her write many more songs and sing much more in the way that a lot of singers today live to be 60 or 70. I said, so I'm only saying that because I think you're overlooking the fact that had she been treated, she would still be alive, and you could still have Janis Joplin in your life, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And it was a sort of a poignant moment because she kind of reflected on it. And then I sat down sort of somewhat embarrassed, which she should have been, because we weren't at all disrespecting in any sense their heroes. And so that's one story. I'll give you one more story if you have time for one more story.
Yeah, plenty of time.
When I was in Vietnam, one of my, I love Janis Joplin, I love Jim Morrison, and a lot of the guys in Vietnam used to carry around something called boom boxes. I don't think your audience may be familiar with them. Maybe they are.
Well,
I've lost track of where.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. In any case, there was a boom box one night. It was 2 in the morning. We started hearing tracer rounds of 50 caliber machine guns going off, and it's very close by. And in that particular episode, they were using tracer rounds so they could locate where they wanted to move the 50 calibers to adjust to hit the bad guys. And it was pitch black out, and all you saw were tracer rounds. And out of the clear blue, somebody pressed the button on a boombox, and out comes one of Jim Morrison's best-known songs, "People Are Strange." And if you don't think that was a strange moment in the heat of battle, to hear that language, that song being sung, everybody just turned and tried to figure out where the song was coming from. Didn't know who had hit the boombox. But you say, well, there's an apt description of warfare. Not only are people strange, but warfare is really strange. So it just sort of it etched in my mind, that song, and I knew it real well, and I liked it, and I thought, I didn't like it in that instance. That really made me uncomfortable.
Yeah. So Barnes & Noble sent you and your brother around the country on a book tour?
We made arrangements with all of the Barnes & Nobles. What they'll do is they'll give you they like to make sure that they match up books with audiences. So they various audiences. For example, we had a very successful tour in Oregon, especially a block named Eugene, Oregon, where it's almost as if you were still in the 1960s.
Uh-huh.
The tie-dye is still the most
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they all understood him. We were told once that we'd better hurry up and write this book when people found out we were writing the book, and they said because Janis Joplin fans are dying by the dozens, and so are Jim Morrison fans. They're getting in their 60s or 70s.
Yeah, right.
And then you have who knows what you have, right? But we did not discover that. The young folks today, the young kids today, are really, what's the word, eclectic in their musical taste. So they know that music. And I've said it in several of my classes, I'm thinking that they didn't know it. And I'd say, well, there was this great gal named Janis Joplin. And the kids all look at me in somewhat like disgust, like, what do you think? We're stupid? We don't know who Janis Joplin is.
Yeah.
I said, well, it's 40 years ago. And you guys were 17. How the hell would you know their music, right? So they like the music too. And Morrison, they appeal to different audiences, qualitatively different audiences. So when we've spoken to Janis Joplin fans, it's a hysterical up kind of orientation on the part of the fans. And Jim Morrison fans are almost always introspective, reflective, and if I don't mind my adding this, somewhat depressed. And afraid after they listened to us that they were Jim Morrison types, borderline personality. You can like their music and not be at all connected to borderlines.
Yeah. Another story I've heard about Jim Morrison is like somebody, I remember reading in Rolling Stone magazine or something where somebody was driving down the road with him in a car one day, and it's like he was on acid and it was totally unpredictable in his driving. You didn't know if he'd go down the street or just take off across somebody's yard or sidewalks. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. That's the episode, we think, and given the court records that we examined, that got him, that he got both arrested and he got sentenced to a certain kind of, here's what you have to do to avoid jail. You have to go see a psychiatrist. For one of the faux therapy chapters in the book where my brother wrote, he's had extensive experience treating borderline personalities. So he's got all of the language down. He knows exactly what they're going to say and when they're going to say it and the various questions that he might raise with them. So that was the faux chapter on Jim Morrison is taken right out of the fact that he was ordered to go to a psychiatrist because they thought he was crazy. Now I'm using
what happened in actual fact?
He only went a couple of times. The psychotherapist said, or the therapist at the time said, I'm afraid he's openly hostile to the whole process. He wouldn't participate. He wouldn't cooperate, and so forth. Now, my brother took that. He couldn't make a faux therapy session that was only a page and a half. So what he did was he used that as a basis for a long-term therapeutic, maybe 15 or 30 or so sessions with him as the therapist, dealing with a guy like Jim Morrison. It was hostile, insulting, wicked, I think is the way I described him. I said I would have had to get up out of my chair and punch him, but my brother said, he's a sick guy, and you have to understand where it's coming from and then make the necessary appeals to sanity and rationality and so forth. So, that incident actually happened, and so was the one that I don't know if you know the one about people try to explain their behavior, why they died at 28. Apparently, Jim Morrison, when he was a kid, was driving with his family and came across a terrible accident, and it was in one of the western states where there are Native American Indians. And it was so awful that it was ever indelibly etched in his brain. They want to find a source for what we are now referring to, not me, but modern psychotherapists refer to as a borderline disorder. And so they located in some emotional, traumatic incident in the past.
Right.
And of course, none of that has panned out at all. If you look at the research that's been done of borderlines, they don't. Janis Joplin, for example, is an excellent example of someone who had no trauma in her life of that sort. Came out of a typical white middle class family in Texas. Mother, loving family, mother a musician, father, a upstanding member of the community, not overly harsh with their children. None of the things that people like to use symptomatically as being the problem why they generate that way. But nonetheless, you go to book signings and people want to throw that at you, and you say, well, I guess you haven't actually read the book. Because in the book we try to dispel the mythological about Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison.
Yeah, when you think of rock stars in general, I mean, there are people. I mean, there's this thing about that they're acting out the fantasies of what average people aren't allowed to do. For example, before the Rolling Stones were well known, one of the incidents that excited their popularity was a photograph of Keith Richards peeing on the side of a gas station over in England.
Sure.
And then Ozzy Osbourne reportedly bit the head off of a live bat during a contract
so we're told anyway. Yeah,
negotiation. Yeah, who knows what actually happened? And Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin have a plethora or a cornucopia of stories of over-the-top kind of things, events, if you will, happening to them. How do you differentiate what's drama, PR, from your brother's insight into the very nature of their, psychiatric problem?
Yeah, that's a most excellent question. It's the kind of question that if you ask trained psychotherapists, people who are familiar with the disorder and all of its manifestations, will tell you is the only people that are capable of doing it are those sorts of people, because as I said earlier, entertainers get a lot of leeway. They get a lot of latitude, and they also get a lot of publicity. And it's easy to mask mental illness of a certain sort of personality disorders under the rubric, the broad rubric. Well, it's my gig, my act, what I have to do, and I do these things for effect, and it's supposed to. And sure enough, I'm not an entertainer in a sense. I don't know the inside of the entertainment industry, but I'm willing to acknowledge, as any psychotherapist would say, yeah, well, there's a certain amount of that is perfectly fine. But I guess you would start to disentangle it with a lot of technical distinctions between behaviors that are designed to facilitate your image and behaviors that you don't have any control over. For example, drug use and alcohol use. Janis was fond of uppers and lowers. If you know technical, and you say, well, why that? Why those? That didn't have anything to do with their image, unless they talked a lot but didn't actually use it. People joke about doing drugs, but they don't actually themselves use it. They just use it for effect. Right? And you say, okay, fine. But if people are actively using it to a point where they're rendered unconscious, or where they begin to do dangerous things, you would have to put a mark there, a dividing line, and say, the minute you're into those sorts of self-destructive behaviors, that's not contributing to your image. That's contributing to your undermining, or in this case, your deaths, and both in the case of Janis and Jim. But there are questions that would come out in a therapeutic setting in terms of what the patient would say about early childhood experiences, relation to mom and dad, or the way in which they see themselves and others see them, that would be markers for most psychotherapists. I don't know if that's the kind of question you were.
I mean, that helps a lot. I'm curious now. Jim Morrison refused therapy. What happened with Janis? Did she ever get any help?
She stayed longer, but it didn't help much because you have to appreciate this was done in the 60s, the late 60s, 68, 67, and if you ask anybody that's done any research or something, they'll tell you that they didn't even have a term for it in those days. It was just referred to as self-destructive behavior, or other kinds of terms that were not all that precise at all. They were vague. It's like a doctor says when they don't know what's wrong with you, you got a virus. I'm sorry, I don't want to. You got a virus. Okay, fine. So there wasn't that much known about it, and that's why we think over the last 40 years a whole lot more has become known about it. There's been an awful lot of research done, and there have even been significant improvements in their treatment. It's long-term, it's really difficult treatment, so a lot of therapists don't want to deal with it because it's like my brother's got a phone that he can be reached by certain of his patients because they're desperate enough they need to have a voice to speak to, and it usually calms them down. And I won't say anything about who those patients are, just that that whole era had no idea what they were really dealing with. So it's unfortunate because those two, at least, if not hundreds of thousands more, I don't know how many you put a number on it, died. Yeah. So one last thing I want to say is that the difficulty of disentangling the entertainment stage stuff from the borderline disorder. It was in the 60s, if you can remember the 60s. I remember, I had lived through them, okay? You're young enough to remember them too, okay? There was a countercultural orientation that developed then, that no, you don't trust anybody in positions of authority, that everybody is out there like the NSA spying on you, that the war, the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, you can lump them all together, a very violent period in American history. So there was an orientation that the more out there you are, the more popular you'll be, and the more official you'll be, the more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Credibility.
Credibility, yeah. You're not bought out. You're real, and that's what Janis and Jim were attributed to them. Yeah, they're really honest. You know, they've got authority of that sort. So that's another reason why it was masked. In addition to not knowing much about it, I don't want to bore you with those technical details, but what the hell.
In the process of doing this research, for the book, are there any aspects of their lives that most people aren't aware of? Or things that happened that you can think of that
well, I guess I would say I was myself always struck by the brilliance behind the songwriting and the song making and the singing. As I say, I don't think you'll find another singer, performer out there like Janis Joplin. You may find one again, but
she really put her heart out there.
Oh man, she was. They used to call it honest. She was honest, and she was out there. She used to say she wouldn't sing anything she didn't believe in. So, from my perspective, there are a lot of things about their lives. Interesting things. Jim Morrison's father was an admiral in the Navy.
Really?
In the Navy.
That's right. I'd forgotten that.
And so people used to attribute this stuff. Oh, admirals and that discipline, and military discipline, nothing to. You'd have to find a pattern there to be able to say such a thing, to make that case stick. So there are a lot of surprises about what people would say about them that when we ran across what literature was available to us. I always thought it's kind of off the wall to say, yeah, his father was an admiral, so we're going to assume that it was rigid military indoctrination that produced Jim Morrison's dark and foreboding visions.
Not so.
Not even close. Yeah. I mean, you'd have to prove it.
So living in the dead zone by Ralph Faris and Dr. Gerald Faris is at Amazon now, and people can look into it and see if they have.
Sure. It's also published in France. There's an edition that's the French in French. The French love Jim Morrison, by the way.
Oh yeah,
go figure.
His remains are over there.
He's buried in Chase.
If they haven't been stolen away, I think that there's.
I don't think so. They've got it guarded. Yeah,
somebody's always trying to get hold of them.
Maybe the NSA is watching.
Who knows? Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Faris.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
We so happy we alive, we together can survive.